Thank you for that generous introduction. It's good to be back here at the Brick Church. It's always fun to be here in the adult education class, so I'm grateful for the invitation, and particularly on this topic of the past and the future of the Presbyterian Church and the mainline church in general. So I'm talking today around this theme of hope for a resurrected church. So mentioned decline, the issue of not just the Presbyterian Church, but the so-called mainline Protestant churches in general. The Lutherans, Episcopalians, Methodists, all have been hit the high point of their cultural influence and their numeric size back in the 1950s, and have been on a slow but pretty steady decline since then in terms of both of those things, cultural influence and numeric size. So at this point, we're getting to some panic in the mainline Protestant circles who feel like, well, we've been doing this for 30 or 40 years. We can see where the trend lines are. This is not good. And how are we going to turn this around? And is there hope to turn this around? And so there's a lot of talk now about the death of the mainline church, that the church is going to die, that this is something we need to be scared about, that we need to be working to prevent as much as we can, or that it's just too late and it's inevitable and we might as well just start packing our bags. So that's part of what we mean when we say the narrative of decline. Recently, the new stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church USA, named J. Herbert Nelson, that's the highest elected office in the Presbyterian Church USA, he came out pretty strongly and said the church is not dying, it's reforming. And so he was pushing very much against this narrative of death and decline. So what I want to say here, just to start us off, is that they're both wrong. There is real death that is happening, and we need to not pretend that that's the case. It also doesn't mean that death is the end. One of the things that's been really interesting to me as somebody who spends a lot of time out across the nation in Protestant circles is the level of fear of death in Christian churches. When our whole ethos, our whole reason for being is that death doesn't get the last say. And so our faith is rooted in a theology of resurrection. And we need to acknowledge that, because there's no resurrection without death. By definition, there has to be death in order to have resurrection. So when you are playing with these ideas, I don't think we're just looking at reforming the church. When the Reformation happened, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, so I'm going to speak in broad terms, but when the Reformation happened in Europe, there were very different cultural things going on. There was huge upheaval in terms of technology and ideas and cultural shifts and politics. All of that was going on, and there are some real analogies between that and the situation we're in now culturally, with the internet and upheaval with political alignments and all of those sorts of things. But the church itself was in a very different place, and I don't think we're at a place now where we're simply reforming what and how we do things and kind of representing it for a new day. I do think we're in a time of real transformation. So if you think about resurrection in Scripture, when Jesus dies on the cross, he's dead for 3 days, he's resurrected again, and then there's these series of appearances. If you read those stories, one of the things that's emphasized over and over again is that he's really there. You know the story of Thomas, where he puts his hand in the wounds, and you know he won't believe until he's actually seen Jesus himself, that he's actually alive and walking around, and Jesus appears and he invites Thomas to actually touch him. There's another scene where Jesus encounters the disciples, and he's on the beach and he makes a barbecue. He cooks some fish and they have breakfast together, and he's eating the fish to show that he's a real body. So resurrection isn't just a metaphor in the Christian church. It is a new body, but it's one that is both the same and different. Jesus also appears and disappears. He more or less goes through walls. And so there's different dynamics to this as well. And I think that's a good image for us when we're going to talk about resurrection in the church today. That if we're resurrecting the church, it is going to have a real body. We are the body of Christ as the church. It will be recognizable. It won't be suddenly the Presbyterian Church has nothing to do with the way it was before and doesn't have the same name and doesn't look anything the same and has no real connections to that. There will be recognizable continuity. It will be something you can touch. And yet it will act differently and look differently and behave in new ways. So that's what I want to talk about today with that, is just to hold that image in there of we're not in a time where we can pretend things aren't changing. We're also in a time where I think there's an enormous opportunity for new and more vibrant life in the life of the church. And so crisis or opportunity, one of my colleagues at Auburn just uses the word Christ-opportunity. And for a lot of things, that holding those things together creates enormous opportunity. And sometimes it takes a crisis to break open enough space for new life to happen. And that involves some death, but it also creates an opportunity for life. So let me talk briefly about some of these dynamics of death that are real. Or to put it bluntly, in the next 20 years without radical changes, the Presbyterian Church, USA, will essentially disappear from New York City. The current trends right now, there's about 98 congregations in the Presbyterian New York City. Over 80% of them are 50 members or less. In those congregations, the average age is 75 and older, and worship attendance is about 15 or so a week. If you just do the math, those churches simply can't survive without some radical transformation. There's some larger, healthier churches like this one, and several others in Manhattan. There's several very vibrant churches in Queens, and there's some other new ones coming up. So there won't be literally no Presbyterians, but the overwhelming majority of those congregations will cease to function unless there's a radical transformation. That's not just true in New York City. One of the things I like to say is that New York is unique, but it's not nearly as unique as it thinks it is. And those dynamics are true across the country. They're true in suburban context. They're true in the South and the Midwest, not just the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest. They're not just, there's been a narrative for about 30 years from conservative Christians that death is a liberal problem, and liberal meaning anybody that's not them. So they've been arguing, well, we're still growing and we're doing well, and it's just those mainline Protestants who don't really believe anything the way they're supposed to, and this is their comeuppance for that. So the good news is now everybody's in the same boat, because all of the conservative denominations, predominantly white denominations, are in decline. The Southern Baptists are panicking right now because they've had 5 years of significant membership declines in adult baptisms. The Roman Catholic Church is growing, but it's growing in non-white contexts. So with the Latino immigration and other things like that, the Pentecostals are growing because of storefront churches and immigrant neighborhoods and those sorts of things. But the white context, the white Protestant kind of context, and the white evangelicals are all equally in decline. So it's also important to understand that itself is part of an even larger narrative. So culturally, we're in a time now where there is some significant shift and decline in things that we as a nation have tended to take for granted. So first, just institutions in general, anything that is more or less an institution, and particularly one that is built around the idea of membership as its organizing principle, they're all in decline, and all in fairly radical decline, whether it's a museum or social groups or fraternal organizations or whatever it is, they're all in radical decline. So it's part of a larger cultural shift around how we belong to one another and how we are in relationship and whether we're in relationship with one another. It's not just a church problem. And that's important to understand, because we can get very narrow viewpoint on this and feel like, oh, well, if we just did a few things differently in the church, then it'd be fine and people would start coming back again. That's not true culturally right now because everybody who's working with the kind of organization that we are is experiencing the same thing and hasn't figured it out. We've got some significant demographic and cultural shifts going on in the larger society. The decline of the middle class, this rising income inequity, and it's harder and harder to stay economically and socially in a middle class context. We are headed towards, within the next 40 years, depending on which statistics you're following, we're heading towards a situation where there will no longer be a white majority in the United States. There will be what they call a majority-minority situation where there's a racial plurality. There will be no one racial group that has a majority of the overall American population. More generally, there are things going on like what people have been calling the DIY culture, do-it-yourself culture. And that has been breaking down a lot of different cultural traditions that relied on structure and sort of a monopoly on information and technology. So we can talk about that in church circles around the fact that if you read the New York Times weddings announcements these days, there are relatively few clergy who are officiating those services. Most people are officiating them because they've gone online and spent 10 minutes on a website and gotten themselves ordained in the Church of Universal Life or something else like that, and that gives them the credential that they need to be able to marry people. So what would have once always been done by clergy is now just something anybody can do it themselves. You can marry yourselves, you can do funerals, you can do all of these sorts of cultural things that were once the purview of the church. More broadly, the music industry is going through this utter transformation for the exact same reasons. 20 years ago, if you wanted to release an album, you had to go book time in a studio and get an agent and get a recording company behind you and get a significant amount of money. Now, with a $10 microphone, I can plug it into this iPad and record studio quality music and distribute it online for free myself. So this whole shift culturally is going on in almost every aspect of our culture, and it's getting manifested in this radical pushback on anybody who's presented as an expert. So in politics, in economics, in any aspect of culture, and in religion, there is a strong cultural shift against expertise and authority and in favor of doing it yourself. Now, all of those are significant and impact religion in general, but I think they're particularly important for the Presbyterian Church USA because historically, we've been a denomination that has despite our desires and purposes, we've been a denomination that's overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly middle to upper middle class, that has been very institutional. Our biggest legacy besides congregation is schools and hospitals. And so we've always been institutional builders in that sense. And our structure is connectional and depends on mutual accountability, but in a way that there's somebody who's always supervising you. So without going into a whole polity lecture, the session of the Brick Presbyterian Church makes most of the decisions in the life of the congregation except for who the pastors are. And the Presbyterian New York City has to approve a lot of things that sessions do, and so on and so on. So it's hierarchical. It's not as hierarchical as the Episcopal Church or the Roman Catholics, but it's definitely it has that tradition. We're not Congregationalists, and we are part of a long historic institutionalized tradition in a culture that is now viewing anything like that as suspicious. And so congregations now that are springing up that are non-denominational often don't even use the word church. They use words like the gathering place or the journey or those sorts of things, metaphorical sort of attractions, but in a very different sort of way. So that's what's going on. And when we're talking about decline, it's important to put this into the larger context of the cultural shifts that we're dealing with and realize that while it manifests very clearly in the Presbyterian Church, it's not something that we're necessarily generating, and it's not something that's only happening to us. Okay, I'm going to do questions at the end, I guess. I'm going to keep moving right now. But I want to talk particularly about probably the biggest and most radical shift that's going on culturally that impacts the Protestant churches in general and religion in general is the rise of the nuns. That's nuns as in N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N. At Auburn, we do a lot of work with Sister Simone Campbell, who's a very prominent nun, and so she likes to have a lot of conversations about the nuns meeting the nuns. But the nuns as in people who are not religiously affiliated. And it is by far the fastest growing, ironically, religious group in the country. Are people who are not religiously affiliated. Is now about 20% of the entire population. So, and has been growing exponentially just over the last few years. So, there's been if you want to sell a book, write something about the nuns. It doesn't really matter what it is. Just say that that's what it is, and everybody in religious communities will buy it because there's a sense of fear at this development and a sense that this is a radical cultural shift. And everybody's trying to figure out, well, how do we connect with them and how do we convince them that we're okay and they should come into our churches? The good news is that it's actually not that complicated. The bad news is that it's not easy either to make that connection. So if you actually listen to the typical set of critiques from the religiously unaffiliated around organized religion, that's usually the language that they use. It's a couple of things that jump out. One is their sense of organized religion is that it's too political, meaning partisan, that it's aligned with partisan forces in the culture and basically is either the Republican or Democratic Party at prayer and is involved in a lot of the culture war kinds of things on a variety of sides, but the sense that they are involved in partisan fighting rather than the particular issues that are facing people today. That's one major critique. A second one is that they're inherently hypocritical. That's not a new critique of the church. In fact, it's a self-critique of the church since the upper room. But it's particularly true, and what they really mean by that is you say you're about community and inclusion and love, and you spend all your time fighting with one another and arguing over who gets to be thrown out. There's some truth to that. So there's a pushback on that. And specifically, a lot of them just say, I can't be a part of any organization that is about excluding people. So if I can't bring my friend of another religion or another race or of who's LGBT, identifies as LGBTQ, any of those kinds of things, or even if it feels like a place where I can't come and really ask questions, where I can't struggle with things, where there's not room for me to wrestle, instead I'm being given answers, then I'm not interested in it. And so all of those are part of the definition of exclusion. So interestingly, the critique of the religiously unaffiliated is not that the church is too churchy, which is the way we tend to think about it. So maybe we change the music, or we don't wear suits and we try to act more cool and all of that sort of thing. Then they'll come, and that's just completely wrong, according to pretty much everything that's being said out there. What's the critique is actually that the church isn't enough of the church, that it doesn't actually live out its values of being a community that welcomes all kinds of different people, that really does embody God's love in the world and tries to be a healing force. Now, we can say part of that's a PR problem, and it is, and part of it is real, and we need to be acknowledging that and thinking about how to respond to that. But what I want you to take away, if nothing else, is that none does not mean no faith. None does not mean no openness to the Spirit of God or to spirituality in general. Most people who are nuns identify pretty deeply in terms of spirit. They are profoundly motivated by desiring community, but by that they mean authentic community that requires diversity of culture and opinions and all of those sorts of things. And they are really interested in doing things to better the world. So what we traditionally have called social justice work or outreach work in the church, they cared very deeply about, but they want it to actually be something that they can be involved in and that they can see the impact of out in the world. So the good news is that the Christian tradition actually has some really good resources and answers to those issues if we're willing to actually put them out there. We have a long theology and ethos of hospitality, of love, of healing the world, of working for community and justice, and for nurturing people in their faith, starting with them where they are and helping them to figure out what questions they're really trying to ask and how they can begin to start answering them. So if you've been hearing a lot about this, and there is usually one of two responses in the church, which is either, well, they're just a bunch of atheists and we can ignore them, and they don't really know how good we are, and if they would just come in and join the church, then they'd see that. That's not a really helpful set of responses. But the other response of looking at people as how do we convince them to join us is also not the right response. Because the sense of this community in particular is so fine-tuned around authenticity. There's the old joke about the most important thing in the world is sincerity, and once you can fake that, you can do anything. You actually have to care about people and to be willing to reach out to them and start with them where they are and be in dialogue with them and have our own traditions and questions and answers question in that, because that's what a relationship is. And a redefinition to some degree on community. So if we're willing to do that, though, there's all kinds of avenues and possibilities for radical new ways of the church really being more faithful and being more vibrant in society today. Okay, how am I doing on time? All right. So I'm going to map out just a couple things here, and then I'm going to open it up for questions or reactions, and if you want to throw things and that sort of thing. So what does resurrecting the body look like? There's a few things I think we as the church, the Presbyterian church, but the Christian church in general need to do in this current situation. The first is to actually believe that God is up to something, and that our job is not to fix things, but our job is to actually discern where the Spirit's moving and to be open to that and responsive to it. Now, that sounds like a preacher's sort of cop-out on these sorts of things because it's not 7 easy steps, but if we don't believe that, then what's the point? That goes to the very core of who we are as Christians, and our whole tradition has been about the sense that God is continually engaged in the world, that God is engaged in the world beyond the church, but also in the church and through the church. And our tradition in particular talks about that we are reformed and always reforming according to the Word of God. So discerning how that happens means that we have to expect that God's up to something, and we can find ways to see what that is. So I think one of the most important things that we need to do on the congregational level to be able to do that, to be in touch with that Spirit and to be able to discern it, is to move pretty strongly towards what I would call a culture of experimentation. That we need to, the church typically has a set of things that we do, that we've done for a long time, and that we either know work or that we know should work on some level, and they're not working anymore. And so our response has often been, well, we need to work harder to make those things work. That doesn't work. If it's no longer connecting, then efficiency is not going to provide any value on that. And one of the things I spend a lot of time doing is working with pastors who are on the verge of burnout because they've been working harder and harder trying to do the things they've always done better and feel like nothing is really happening as a result of that, and it must be their fault. So to be able to understand that there are these radical shifts in the culture that by definition, what we've always done is no longer going to apply because the situation has shifted so much, means that we need to be experimenting to see what are some new possible responses that we can do on a congregational level or on a cultural level. And not just simply saying, all right, so we're going to spend the next 2 years doing a strategic plan, and we're going to map out 80 new ministry programs, and we're going to do all of this other kind of thing. But rather to say, we may not know what we can or should do. So let's try some small things and see where the unexpected successes are, where the unexpected failures are. And so then the governing bodies, the session or other things like that, then become less of an organizing, managing sort of force and more of a scientific review board. So where are the experiments paying off, and what can we learn from that? How can we build something, measure what's going on, and then learn from that and pivot in new directions? I think that culture of experimentation takes the risk level down a lot that we all feel in terms of being said, well, we got to do some things differently. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean we throw everything out and just start making up stuff. It means we start trying to figure out what are the things that are unique to our culture, that are unique to our tradition and to our resources that we can present in new or different ways and see where the connections are and then respond to that. So I think there's a few key elements in church ministry that we need to be holding up as we do this. The first one is a real emphasis on spiritual formation of individuals. And often in the mainline Protestant churches, we've gotten away from that. We've moved to things like this, education. So this is important. It's really great. In the Presbyterian Church, we value worshiping God with our mind as well as our spirits. And this is part of spiritual formation, is learning and trying to understand where our faith is leading us. But having a more holistic understanding of spiritual formation in terms of our own faith and practice and understanding and being able to unite that. And that's part of the critique that we hear from the religiously unaffiliated, that they don't want just the intellectual part. They want something that's experiential, that allows them to ask questions and wrestle with the deep intellectual pieces, but also allows them to experience something of the beauty and the mystery of the faith as well. And that helps them identify where their gifts are and helps them figure out how to connect their story to the larger story. So nobody joins a church to be on a committee. And we tend to work that way, though. So I'm not saying we need to get rid of all committees, but I'm saying we need to provide opportunities that really feed people's souls and not fall into the trap of saying, well, if we give them something to do, then they'll get involved. People aren't looking for things to do. We're in a very busy culture and a very frenetic culture. What people are looking for are things that matter, that speak to them, that draw on their own uniqueness, then draw them in community with others. And so we need to keep that in front of us. I think that there's going to be continuing a need for communal worship and support. We may need to find some different ways of doing that. Everybody's talking about worship attendance has shifted, and people who used to come every week now come every couple of weeks or even once a month to weekly worship. I don't think the solution there is just to give up on weekly worship. I think it's actually crucial to the experience of the faith. And more importantly, that people who are outside of the church now are really hungry for community. And so I'm really critical of people who want to sort of move away from the idea of communal worship and really focus only on small pieces. But I do think we need to have multiple opportunities. And different congregations will have different sets of resources around that. And so finding a place in which we can offer a number of different ways of being in community with one another and with God. And then finally, to be really involved in justice work, that people don't want to just help people, they want to make a difference in the world. And we do too. The Christian church isn't about making people feel a little bit better. It's about embodying God's love and justice in the world. And part of one of the essential things that Jesus was doing when he was performing miracles, feeding, healing, even resurrecting a few times, was he was proclaiming the gospel through those actions. And so while the healing and the feeding and the resurrecting was all important to those individuals, he was also saying this is what the kingdom of God is like. It's not just giving somebody something to eat today. It's saying this is the way it should always be for everybody. And we're going to need to put ourselves to work on that. So finding ways to do that. All right, I'm going to name two quick things and then I'm going to stop. I think this has some implications on the future of congregations. I think that we're going to continue to have a need and a place for vibrant, large congregations like Brick Church. They're not going anywhere. They're still doing wonderful work and have the capacity to continue to nurture a wide range of people in a lot of ways. I think, though, that when you look at churches that are under 400 members, that the model that is out there right now is going to work less and less and pretty quickly. That's just not economically feasible anymore for those congregations, and so we're going to need to go to multiple models of congregations. We shouldn't expect a congregation of 200 people to be functioning like a congregation of 2,000 people, but just on a smaller scale. So house churches, pop-up churches in bars and coffee shops and theaters and those kinds of things, I think we should be empowering those things. And then the final thing is that I do a lot of work around money and giving, and one of the constant refrains I hear in the church is that we don't have enough money to do what we need to do. That the church doesn't have the assets it needs, and that's just simply not true. If you saw the story maybe a week or so ago, talking about the economic impact of religion in the United States, it was $1.2 trillion. It has a larger economic footprint than Google and Apple combined. So there are an awful lot of resources out there. The question is, how are we using them? And part of the opportunity in this shift, and where a lot of congregations are going to be dying, is that there is real estate and there is money there that can be repurposed in a number of ways. And so what would a ministry venture capital fund look like in the church, where we're actually empowering people to do experimenting with these different kinds of churches and putting the resources behind them? So that's some of the questions that I'm asking right now.